It was a calm morning in Glendale, but everything changed when 3 motorcycles roared through the quiet streets. The sharp sound of their engines shattered the peaceful ambience of a cafe usually filled with a soft hum of conversations and the gentle clink of cups. The roar of the bikes made the customers freeze, smiles faded, and a heavy silence descended on the room. The motorcycles stopped abruptly at the door, their engines cutting off with a jarring finality. And the room? It became motionless. All eyes in the cafe turned toward the group, but there was one presence that stood out more than the rest: Zeus, Michael's guide dog. His unblinking gaze observed the scene with unnerving calm. While the noise of the motorcycles had shaken everyone, Zeus was the first to sense the danger. His eyes were locked, tense, and his body still, but there was an electric force in the air, like the simple look from him could destroy any threat. Michael, sitting at his usual spot, felt the change instantly. His hand reached for Zeus's neck, and he could feel the tension in the dog's muscles. It was clear, something was wrong. The leader of the group, Chuck, walked in with heavy steps. The sound of his boots echoed as though he were walking on earth, not the cafe floor. His leather jacket was patched with symbols, his tattoos exposed with pride. But his grin? A mix of amusement and menace. He scanned the room, like a predator observing its prey. Chuck stopped in front of Michael and Zeus. The room was dead silent, every eye fixed on them. Chuck's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Nice dog you got there," Chuck said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He stepped closer, his smile widening, more threatening now. "Guard dog, huh? Looks like he could tear someone apart." Michael didn't flinch. His voice was steady, controlled. "He's my guide dog. He helps me navigate the world, since I can't see." Chuck chuckled, running his fingers along his jacket as his gaze locked onto Zeus. He took a step forward, but Zeus didn't budge. The dog only observed, unmoving, calculating. "Bet he's expensive. Well-trained, I bet. Must be nice to have a bodyguard with 4 legs." The air thickened. Zeus made no sound. But something about his posture, rigid, calculating, chilled the atmosphere. When Chuck raised his hand, like he was going to test the dog's limits, Zeus gave a slight shift of his head. His eyes locked onto Chuck's with such intensity that the man froze mid-movement. He hesitated. The silence was deafening. The other patrons in the cafe were paralyzed, eyes darting between Zeus and the intruders. Some tried to discreetly inch toward the exit, but no one dared make a sound. The tension was suffocating, and everyone knew, one wrong move, and chaos could unfold. "You got yourself one hell of a dog," Chuck muttered, his bravado faltering just enough for the others to notice. One of his companions nervously laughed, trying to fill the silence, ***. Zeus still didn't move. His eyes never wavered. He didn't need to do anything more. His presence alone was enough to send a powerful message. He wasn't just a dog, he was a force waiting to explode. Michael, feeling the escalating tension, ran his fingers along Zeus's collar. His voice remained steady, though his grip tightened just slightly. "Easy, Zeus. It's fine. We're fine." But the atmosphere was anything but fine. Chuck was losing his patience. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with fury. Now, he was inches from Michael. "You really think that dog's gonna protect you?" Chuck challenged, his voice dripping with hostility, ***. Zeus rose slowly, like a storm gathering force before it strikes. His muscles tensed. His eyes were unblinking. His teeth began to show, a clear sign he was ready to act. The air itself seemed to stop, the cafe holding its breath. "Chuck." Someone whispered, a voice low, laced with warning. Chuck hesitated. His arrogance was still there, but it was beginning to crack. He shot one last look at Zeus, his pride wounded. Then, with a glare of pure contempt, he turned away. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The doors slammed shut behind Chuck and his group, but the silence didn't lift. The air was thick with tension. Michael and Zeus stayed exactly where they were, unshaken. Zeus stood, eyes still fixed on the door. The room was far from calm. His gaze calculated every movement in the room, sensing that the threat was far from over. Outside, the sound of the motorcycle engines roared back to life. But this time, they didn't leave. They circled around, stopping just outside the cafe. The growl of the engines grew louder, echoing through the walls. And with it, the looming sense of danger intensified. The roar of the motorcycles continued outside, a looming, threatening presence. With each passing second, more bikes arrived, creating a deafening sound. The cafe, once a peaceful and comforting refuge, now felt like a silent battleground. Zeus, still standing, his muscles tense, was perfectly attuned to the danger approaching. His eyes, locked onto Chuck and his gang, never blinked. The silence was growing unbearable. The smell of tension filled the air, as if everyone could sense that something big was about to unfold. Chuck, finally stepping back a little, began speaking with the other bikers. His words were low, but they couldn't hide the rising anger. He was starting to realize that Zeus wasn't just any dog. This animal was more than prepared to face anyone. "What do you want, old man?" Chuck asked, his voice dripping with disdain. But something in the way Zeus looked at him made Chuck's confidence falter. There was something primal in the dog's gaze. He wasn't just warning Chuck, he was calculating. Every move, every breath of Chuck's was being registered. Michael knew that Zeus was in total control of the situation, but fear still gripped his chest. He wasn't a man of confrontations. He never had been. But with Zeus by his side, he felt something different. There was a silent but overwhelming force emanating from his four-legged friend. And now, they were ready to face whatever came their way. The sound of the motorcycles grew even louder. The noise seemed to reverberate within the walls of the cafe, as though the very building was bracing for the impact that was coming. Chuck moved forward again, closer now, his fists clenched. "You think you're going to intimidate me with this dog? You don't know who you're dealing with," Chuck said, moving ever closer. His tone was growing more hostile. His words were harsh, but there was a crack in his posture. The arrogance that once dominated his body was starting to fade. Zeus growled softly, a guttural sound that seemed to cut through the air, a clear warning. The risk of an attack was imminent, but unlike other dogs, Zeus didn't need to bark or charge to assert his dominance. He was communicating everything with his eyes, and his eyes said, "Don't you dare." The attention of the cafe was now fully focused on the small but powerful standoff between Zeus and Chuck. Some people were standing up, hesitantly, watching as things unfolded. They knew that if something happened, there would be no turning back. It was a tense moment, the air heavy, and what happened next would change everything. Michael didn't know what to do. His hand was tense on Zeus's leash, feeling the steady pulse of his dog, but he also felt the pressure. A simple wrong move could trigger something unpredictable. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next step. Chuck, now a bit farther back, looked towards the other bikers still outside. More bikes were pulling up. He was no longer alone. Something was about to explode, and he knew it. He looked at Zeus one last time, his dark gaze now daring. But there was hesitation, a small doubt. It was no longer the pride of a man, but the awareness of a predator who knew when a challenge was too great. Zeus somehow sensed the shift. The tension in the air, the change in Chuck's behavior. And slowly, without taking his eyes off him, Zeus took a step back. The atmosphere seemed to be slowly combusting, everyone preparing for a final move. But what would that move be? The cafe was completely still. The previous chatter about cappuccinos and the rush of daily life had vanished. Now it was Michael and Zeus's fate, against a much bigger threat, that was at stake. With each passing second, more motorcycles arrived, creating a sense of encirclement, as though the cafe were being surrounded. Chuck still seemed to wrestle with his own anger, but doubt was now written all over his face. His eyes, once full of disdain, now held a glimpse of insecurity. Zeus was just beginning to show signs of a possible attack. But for now, he remained firm, in total control. What would happen next? What would Chuck's next move be? Would they make it out of there unscathed? The seconds dragged on, each one longer than the last. The tension was at its peak. And the cafe? The last sound that could be heard was the muffled roar of the motorcycles. Michael could only think of Zeus. What else could his dog do to protect them both? The tension in the air was palpable. The entire room was frozen, watching every movement of Zeus, the guide dog, and every second felt like an eternity. Chuck, the gang leader, was still staring down the dog with a defiant look, but something in the air was beginning to shift. Michael felt it. The way Zeus was acting, the way the dog's body was tensing, it was something Michael knew all too well. The dog knew when something wasn't right. Chuck, feeling the pressure building, decided to step back. But before turning away, he threw one last contemptuous look at Michael. He knew he couldn't let this scene weaken him in front of his men. With a quick gesture, he signaled to the other gang members. They left the cafe, but not before making one last remark, as if trying to maintain their facade. The roar of their motorcycles echoed down the street, but to Michael's surprise, Zeus didn't relax. The dog remained on alert, eyes fixed on the door. What was happening? He could feel the pressure in the room rising. Something was about to go down, but what? Suddenly, the sound of engines returned, this time much louder, much more threatening. One by one, the motorcycles started coming back, but this time with more men, more bikers. The sound of wheels scraping against the asphalt filled the air, a growing tension settling in that felt almost surreal. Michael's breath quickened. Zeus stayed in full alert, his jaw clenched. Something was about to explode, but he didn't know what. And then the gang leader, Chuck, finally approached again, this time with a crueler smile on his lips. The cafe was in dead silence. Michael could hear the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor and the nervous murmurs of the other patrons, who were already starting to back away, one by one, afraid of what might happen. Chuck, now closer, fists clenched and eyes locked on the dog, said in a low, menacing voice, "I'll teach you who's in charge here." Zeus took a step forward, his eyes locked on Chuck, and the entire room seemed to freeze. The tension became unbearable, the air thick. Chuck, clearly in doubt, hesitated for a second. He realized what was about to happen, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He'd already come too far to retreat now. That's when Michael felt the light touch of Zeus, a kind of nudge with his snout, as if the dog was trying to say something. Michael felt his stomach churn. The dog knew what to do, but still, Michael couldn't let him. The suspense hung thick in the air, the threat looming over them. He knew that, no matter how this ended, it wouldn't be simple. What would happen next?